It's been exactly as advertised. He was going to hit the ground running. He had 4 years of thinking about the possibility of getting back into this position. He made promises along the way. He was much more ready. He came roaring in. Sure, some of it is going to be off-putting because he is reactionary. He is explosive. He is unpredictable. Those were many of the reasons that people aligned with this president.
What you don't do is disappear somebody and then use deportation as a way to crack down on their speech rights. That is just a purely, I don't know how else to put it, but a purely authoritarian move whose intention is to chill any kind of pro-Palestinian advocacy that this administration opposes.
By preventing these situations from ever happening, we actually prevent the negative cascading consequences, and you reduce that incident, but you reduce further down line other retaliatory type crimes.
This is The Metro on 1019 WDET FM. I'm Tia Graham. On March 31st, all staff for the Institute for Library and Museum Services were put on administrative leave as part of the Trump administration's efforts to cut federal spending and eliminate some government agencies. $266 million in grants in libraries, $266 million in grants to libraries and museums across the country seem unlikely to be administered, and at least half of the 75 people on leave are expected to lose their jobs completely. The Institute for Library and Museum Services isn't well known unless you work in a museum or library. That's because the federal agency funds a lot more than exhibits and staff. That includes things like accessibility for people with visual impairments and technologies for archival processing. $266 million is a relatively small amount of money in terms of federal government spending, but according to Devin Ackman, a little bit goes a long way towards accessibility and innovation. He's the director of the Michigan State University Museum and is a board member of the American Alliance of Museums. Senior producer David Lyons spoke with Ackman about what museums stand to lose if the proposed cuts to the Institute for Library and Museum Services happen.
There's museums all over the place. Can you just give us an idea of how big the impact of IMLS really is for American museums?
IMLS, the Institute of Museum and Library Services, is a very small unit, a very small federal agency that is comprised of perhaps 100 employees and operates at about just under $300 million annually. However, they're the primary agency within the federal government that supports museums and libraries nationwide. So the imprint they have, not just on funding, but on education, policy, et cetera, far exceeds the small staff and budget that they have within our federal apparatus.
Mm-hmm. And can you give us an idea of the range of museums and cultural organizations that are part of IMLS? Because I think there's an idea that museums are just the Smithsonian, or if you're in Detroit, really big, long-lasting places like the Detroit Institute of Arts. But we know that museums take on a lot of different shapes and sizes and forms. Can you kind of give us an idea of how varied this world of museums is?
Museums run the full gamut. They are small community-based institutions, a lot of which were galvanized after our nation's 200th anniversary back in 1976. Now, we're just about to hit our 250th anniversary. So we're talking about small regional museums. We're talking about major urban museums. Same thing with libraries. These are academic libraries and community libraries. So it's really all shapes and sizes, as well as geographic location, urban, rural, suburban. And it really also entails, within the museum side, zoos, aquaria. So, museums in and of itself is a very broad umbrella of the types of institutions that we loosely consider as a museum.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess that really raises the stakes for a lot of people. Maybe you don't go to the local historical museum regularly, though you might appreciate it, but maybe you do go to your libraries or your zoos or your aquariums or even botanical gardens, like you said. What role does this funding play in technology upgrades and digitization? Because I know that in the museum world, digitization is kind of a constant challenge, right? There's a lot of archiving that goes on. There's a lot of making information accessible to people, and to stay up to date on accessibility, you have to innovate. So can you talk about how IMLS funding specifically feeds into innovation in museums?
So there are a variety of different programs under both museums and libraries that IMLS funds. For example, the Museums for America portfolio might support collections work, collection stewardship, but it also might support exhibitions. There's also another umbrella that are national leadership grants for both museums and libraries. And these types of funding truly push the fields forward in bold and exciting ways. So some of this might be new, innovative ways of adopting technology, or perhaps how we pack and ship exhibitions in ways that are more environmentally sustainable. So they're really designed to seed a particular idea that can then be leveraged as a learning opportunity for the entire field. So in some ways, it's funding that supports the bread and butter operations of a museum and library, but in other ways that really push us to be innovators and to keep pushing the field forward.
Mm-hmm. And how has that helped with the MSU Museum?
Well, ironically, we have 2 active awards right now. One is very specifically helping with our science collections and the stewardship of that. And I'll add, as an academic museum, just our science collections alone last year led to 150 scholarly new articles that are pushing new knowledge based on those collections. So that's one right there, how we steward our science collections. On the other side, we had just received a new award this year that was really enabling us to use RFID technologies and innovative ways to deliver content to people with low or no visibility. So we were pushing a whole new frontier of accessibility that we didn't have support from any other location. So as you can see, this is impacting us in 2 ways right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I imagine for all the museums across the country that those iterations are all very different. But the thing that unifies them is that IMLS has been the sole department federally that supplies funding, which really feeds that innovation and which eventually turns into a better experience or better community engagement for the people that these museums serve. I'd like to kind of turn a little bit to the benefits of museums for their local community. We have a lot of landmark institutions in Detroit and Metro Detroit. You're familiar with them, I know. I'm trying to understand where people will risk losing connection to each other if IMLS funding is indeed cut and it doesn't come back at some point. How is that human connection going to be affected?
One of the key aspects of IMLS, of course, is funding. That's what we've been discussing here. So how these innovative new things, risk, things like that, we're able to take because we have that financial support. And sometimes you don't always have the buy-in, for example, from an individual donor on a riskier due type of innovation or opportunity. But equally important is all the other stuff that IMLS supports beyond funding. For example, they really push the field forward in terms of training. They often hold convenings that force us to think critically about how we push our missions in new ways. For example, how do we become better community anchors right now in creating space? A recent initiative was combating the rise in anti-Semitism and how museums could support that nationally. So you can see they're not just a funding mechanism, they're a learning mechanism, they're a poly mechanism. They're doing so much more. And all of this, again, is being done with a very small budget and a very small staff.
Can you elaborate a little bit on how tight museum budgets are? Because in 2024, the funding from IMLS was about $267 million. Now, that sounds like a lot of money, but when you look at other types of federal programs and departments, that doesn't actually seem like a lot of money for how many institutions there are. So can you kind of demystify this museum budget for me?
Indeed. I mean, that's a very important point. I mean, we're talking about 0.1% of the federal budget, or for a visual people like myself, that's something like 0.00046. I might have missed a zero in there, but you get my point. It's very minuscule. So it's a small portion of the budget. It's a small staff, but it's having outsized impact. If you look at the ways in which this money is being utilized to create new opportunity, and then the economic impact in the communities, it far exceeds the small investment by the American taxpayer. So there's that there. And again, I would reiterate that it's really crucial, again, not that funding should be the only thing coming from IMLS, but how this enables us to move a field forward and remain relevant in supporting the communities we serve. So for example, on the library side, interlibrary loans and the whole MELCAP program, which allows particularly people in rural areas to have access to information. So by taking this small federal allocation, they're having a massive outsized impact, both on the good side when it's there and adversely when it's gone.
Mm-hmm. And I guess for the flip side of the argument, there are a lot of people who think that we need to spend less on the federal level and we should leave it up to states or local areas or even philanthropy. And philanthropy does support the museums nationally and individually. It depends on the museum. But I guess what's your case to taxpayers that their tax dollars are worth investing in their museums?
I think it makes a lot of sense for us to reconsider how we spend our hard-earned tax dollars. I don't think anyone really maybe attacks that. The question is, how do we prudently assess the value of our tax dollars and make sure we're getting the highest ROI, return on investment? And I think, again, we have a lot of evidence, a lot of data that shows the impact of museums and libraries, and particularly the investment from an institution like IMLS. Conversely, on the other side, when you look at other types of contributed revenue, sure, there are foundations across our nation, and they're doing a lot to support a variety of causes for which they were set up to do, as well as individuals. We're really fortunate to be one of the most generous nations in the world, our citizens. However, we need a diversified portfolio, and this is a very important aspect. Again, that is a very small component of our federal budget, but we can demonstrate its massive impact.
Mm-hmm. And tax dollars, of course, come from people of all political leanings and all kinds of backgrounds, whether they're Democrats, Republicans, independent voters, non-voters. But we know that museums are nonpartisan entities, and so are the people that use them. Can you talk a little bit about how museums and libraries are utilized across the U.S. in a way that's not hyper-partisan like the rest of our culture and society seems to be?
That's a very important point. The American Alliance of Museums actually conducted a study back in 2021 looking at the trustworthiness of museums. And what was essentially found is that museums rank among the most trusted institutions in our nation. And that is regardless of your political persuasion. You could be a Democrat, Republican, regardless. And that's saying something at a time when so many institutions are mistrusted in our nation, that museums are still held in such high regard. So the work they're doing is very critical. And I would argue the same thing for our sisters and brothers in the libraries. So investing in these institutions are critical, especially as we're encroaching upon our nation's 250th anniversary, a time at which we should be really thinking critically about our democracy and our history and where we're going as a nation. So these investments in museums to safeguard our national treasures, our collective memory, is more important now than ever.
Mm-hmm. And just to close out here, you run a museum, the MSU Museum. You're the executive director. What are your next steps? What are you looking at in the future of an uncertain funding circumstance and environment?
Well, like always, our first and foremost priority is making sure we're delivering the highest quality, mission-centric programs and exhibitions. I mean, that's what we're in business to do. So staying focused on that. Now, how we find new ways of fundraising in a challenging ecosystem is going to be challenging, no doubt. There's going to be a lot more organizations competing for the same dollars, whether it's individual donors or for foundations. So right now, we're going through a very stressful period. That's not unlike the Great Recession or even COVID, where we're seeing markets that are declining and a variety of other headwinds. However, we need to stay the course on our most mission-critical work and deliver the value that we've been doing for year after year to our communities that we're serving, first and foremost.
That was senior producer David Lyons speaking with Devin Ackman, director of the Michigan State University Museum and is a board member of the American Alliance of Museums. Coming up, we'll continue our look at cuts to the Institute for Museum and Library Services. As well, we'll take a look at what's going on with the epidemic of measles here in Detroit. We'll be right back on the Metro. Stay right there. This is the Metro on 101.9 WDET FM. I'm Tia Graham. And as we know, reading is fundamental to living a good life. We go to libraries for our books, but they offer a lot more to our communities. For example, public libraries often host concerts for kids and provide internet access for people who need it and serve as warming centers when it's cold. On March 31st, all staff for the Institute for Library and Museum Services were put on administrative leave. and roughly $266 million in grants to libraries and museums across the country seem unlikely to be administered, and at least half of the 75 people on leave are expected to lose their jobs completely. Joining us now to talk more about what libraries can do for our communities is Russ Ballant. Russ is a longtime Detroiter grassroots organizer, and he was formerly on the board of commissioners for Detroit Public Library. Russ, welcome to the Metro.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Of course. So as we just heard, we were sitting here listening to Devin Ackman, the director of the U.S. MSU Museum. In our previous conversation, federal funding cuts are going to have detrimental impacts on several sectors of our society. So let's talk about the possible cuts to the library system here. In your opinion, what will happen to our public library system, especially in Detroit?
Well, in Detroit, 90% plus or minus a percent or so year to year comes from local millages. Most libraries in Michigan, I think, are primarily millage funded, from what I can tell. It's so widespread that the state legislature banned tax captures of library millages, only libraries, because it's so central to their funding across the state. They exempted Detroit from that ban, however, so Detroit gets heavily tax captured, but the rest of the state does not, because they need those millages. The only way that federal money can come into the library, as I know, or has come into the library, is through the E-rate programs that help expand broadband and internet access, and that has jurisdiction through the Federal Communications Commission. But that's not substantial to it's a project-specific funding. It's not for general funding of the services of the library.
So what does that mean, that Detroit is the only library to get tax captured?
It means that tax captures are not well known to taxpayers, but they, through Public Act 57 of 2017, I believe it was, that the local units of government can take the millages that we pay for everything, for schools, libraries, there's municipal services and so forth, and they can take them and take a cut out of them, put them in a separate account, and give them to investors, whether they're millionaires or billionaires. And when you add that with tax abatements, which says, Mr. Billionaire, you don't have to pay property taxes for 30 years. In Detroit, in the last 10 years, that's added up to $1.25 billion. And the school district lost $420 million through those processes. And the library has lost the equivalent of 2.5 years of its budget from city takings.
Okay, so
in a 10-year period.
In a 10-year period. Yeah. So when we talk about just the cuts that we see, the already lingering issues that we have seen within this Detroit public library system that you've been talking about just briefly, when you were a commissioner for DPL, what were some of those financial challenges that you all did face, just on a regular basis? Well,
the library system is not. It was created by state law in 1865, which is very rare in Michigan. I'm not sure any others were. And in 1881, they passed further legislation, 1901, 1903, 1921, that put the school board in charge of appointing library commissioners, in our case, one per year for 6-year terms. And the city was given certain financial responsibilities. The library, a separate municipal corporation, it has certain municipal powers, such they can, claim property and for public purposes and so forth. But they, unlike most public institutions, the library doesn't have a capital fund, which is a separate process whereby you can sell bonds on the market. The city does it. The school district does it. We used to be able to do it. It can't now because of tax captures too. And the that allows for providing a separate fund for your buildings for when they need roofs and boilers or heating systems or cooling systems and so forth. The library is not allowed by the city to do that. And so we face challenges of having to, squeeze out of our budget some extra surplus to keep a balance fund for emergencies.
I was going to say is that that was an issue within the library system here because there are so many branches within our Detroit Public Library system that it's hard to keep up with all of them. Like you were just saying, like you just had to pull where you could to fix what you could.
That's right.
So Russ, you talked a little bit about those federal cuts and how it would impact DPL, Detroit Public Libraries. You said it would be the internet. It would be internet access.
Well, I think the E-rate is used primarily for setting up the infrastructure for these funds operations, but not the ongoing operational costs. And so we have done that. We have rebuilt a number of library branches across the city. We have 21 branches, and east side, west side, and in the middle, we've rehabbed them and put computer banks in where we might have only had 4. We now might have 15 or 20. And the library before COVID had started the process of having one, even on Sundays, having a branch open on the east side, west side, as well as the main library itself. So there was computer access for school kids. We did this during the school year, but not in the summer, in order to give that help close that digital divide, as they say. Where low-income families can't afford computers. They can't afford monthly charges of internet service, so we're providing that. And the library several years ago was purchased take-home laptops that people can check out for 3 month periods. Nice. Okay, and people say, well, what if people don't bring them back? And they did build in a system where that they can shut it off at the main library, and the laptop is never serviceable again. Oh. But saying that, I do that to answer the obvious question, but we haven't had a problem with that to my knowledge.
Yeah.
Now, I haven't been on the commission for 2 years. I was on for 12 years, but I haven't been on for the last couple, so I'm not most up to date on that regard. But again, it was another attempt to close the digital divide, and we're talking about hundreds of laptops for Detroit kids and families. So, these are some of the kinds of programs we offer in Detroit. I don't know other library systems that are doing that. Yeah. They could be, but I'm always tuned into Detroit.
Yes.
That's me.
You're listening to The Metro on WDET Public Radio. I'm Tia Graham, and I'm joined by Russ Belland. We're continuing our conversation about possible funding cuts to the public museums and libraries across our city, especially here in the city of Detroit. So, Russ, you talked about it. You were on the board for 12 years. You said 2 years now you've been away from it. Can you talk just a little bit about the community itself? You're interacting with the folks who are coming to use the library. I do want to know about the librarians and the administrative staff and all those folks who may be impacted by anything that's coming down federally.
Well, I don't see a direct impact on the librarian staff from the federal cuts. Indirectly, what's very scary to me. I mean, my kids were in Detroit public schools, and I had work where I interacted with the school district and the school board constantly for decades, and I felt really bonded to our school district. There's a fear based on information they're getting from Washington, D.C. and from the education networks that our school district could lose up to 32% of our funding, which means massive school closures, massive loss of staff. And this is where I think the library is going to be able to provide some help. Nothing on the magnitude of addressing adequately the crisis. But, libraries can be learning centers. And our funding is still challenged too. As I said, the city takes big cuts out of the library, millions of dollars a year. When I was on, it was 19% of our revenue they took.
So we have about 30 seconds or so, and I want to make sure that we do get to it because you brought up the city, and I wanted to know about the city's role in protecting the library's services, especially, once again, you just talked a little bit about federal cuts, and they may not actually impact the library directly, but there are other ways that we'll see impacts to the library. So could we talk about what the city of Detroit needs to do to maintain or help spruce up the library system here in Detroit?
Mm-hmm. We've asked the city to stop taking money from the library to if this tragic cut hits our school district as hard as it might, we're going to need every institution and every resource to pull together, and the library can be one of those centers. We did that during COVID. We provided learning centers for when schools had to be closed, and knowing our library people, our staff, even though we've never recovered from the COVID fully, financially speaking, because the city costs escalated on us, we're going to do everything. I'm sure that we'll do everything we can to meet any crisis of education in the city that hits us.
Russ Ballant is a former Detroit Public Library Commissioner and a grassroots organizer. Russ, we will absolutely have you back on.
I will welcome. I'd be honored. Thank you, Tia. I appreciate you. Of
course. Coming up, there's a plan to make Greektown more walkable in 2026. We'll find out more. Stay right there on the Metro. This is WDET-FM, Detroit Public Radio, your connection to news, music, and conversation. And this is the Metro. Stay with us.